Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you are in the world. I'm Doug Sullivan, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Reaching for the Golden Ticket, Long-Term Residency and Citizenship Schemes in the Gulf. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the really great panel that we've got this morning to discuss this issue. Ms. Eman Alhussein is a non-resident fellow for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. She's previously worked as a research fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Saudi Arabia. Her interests include identity and nationalism, gender, cultural and societal change, and religious discourse and reform. Dr. Noora is an assistant professor of international relations at Boston University. Her research focuses broadly on citizenship, migration, and institutions. Her book, Offshore Citizens, Permanent Temporary Status in the Gulf, received the Best Book Prize from the Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association in 2020, and the Distinguished Book Award from the Ethnicity, Nationalism, and Migration Studies section of the International Studies Association this year. She received her PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Omar Al-Ubaydli is also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and is the director of research at Derasat in Manama, Bahrain. He is also an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and at several other institutions. Dr. Al-Ubaydli earned his BA in economics from the University of Cambridge and his MA and PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And our moderator for today's program is Dr. Robert Muglenecki, Senior Resident Scholar at AGSIW. His book, A Political Economy of Free Zones in the Gulf Arab States, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in April of this year. Dr. Muglenecki earned his Doctor of Philosophy from Magdalen College at Oxford University. So Robert, I will turn this program over to you and the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Doug, and it's a pleasure to be here with this great panel. Doug mentioned a lot of the excellent work that everyone here has done on this topic, but just as a way of kicking things off, I think it's worth highlighting a couple of the key publications that our panelists have actually put forth recently, and in many ways have informed a lot of what we're going to talk about in today's event, but also made me think that there are fewer better people out there to join us today. So first, as Doug mentioned, Noora's book, Offshore Citizens, it's somewhere back there on that building and growing bookshelf, but you should definitely pick yourself up a copy. She takes a very interesting approach to the question of extending citizenship to certain groups in the UAE, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as the event gets underway. Omar recently published another really intriguing article with the Cairo Review of Global Affairs. He's written extensively about labor markets, but for the Cairo Review, he discussed this notion of corporate janissaries and this modern version of highly skilled expatriates working, I believe, specifically within Gulf family businesses, but a lot of what he talks about could be applied to broader labor market dynamics. And finally, Eman does a great job filling out our coverage of Saudi Arabia and specifically looking at Saudi employment and unemployment trends, migrant workers, and labor market reforms, a lot of which I refer back to in preparation for this event. So do encourage everyone watching after this event to go back, take a look at some of these publications. And what one takes away from reading these excellent works, as well as following the developments on the ground from day to day, week to week, month to month, is that the status and the role of expatriates in the Gulf is really in a state of flux. On the one hand, there's a clear recognition that expatriates in the Gulf play a crucial role in the economies across the region. And indeed, they're going to continue to be important economic actors as these states seek to rebound from the coronavirus-induced economic downturns. And unsurprisingly, we've seen governments across the region adopt a number of initiatives and other programs intended to create more pathways for expatriates to live and to work in the Gulf. At the top of that list certainly has to be the UAE's legal changes that have allowed certain expatriates to at least receive or be able to receive Emirati citizenship, but there are also national strategies for talent and attraction and retention that were unveiled in 2021 These followed on from a number of emirate level initiatives that sought to attract remote workers, creative professionals, families of students, entrepreneurs, and so on. But this is not just a story about something that's going on in the United Arab Emirates. We also saw Oman recently announcing plans to design a long-term residency scheme for expatriates. And as we all know, Saudi Vision 2030 aims to make the country a livable and desirable destination, not only for its citizenry, but also for global business people and their families. And if we look at the last year, 2020 onward, it's quite clear to me that there was a genuine concern that outflows of expatriates would exacerbate some of the extraordinary economic challenges facing the region. But on the other hand, extending citizenship to expatriates is not without its fair share of controversy. The economic challenges that emerged in 2020, and many of which continue to persist until today, have understandably refocused the attention of many policymakers in the region toward tackling national unemployment and other domestic issues that are at the forefront of concerns for domestic citizens. We see in Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Kuwait a number of workforce nationalization initiatives that have been accelerating over the past few years, and these are intended to reduce the supply of expatriate workers and free up jobs for locals. We could also look toward a number of expat levies and other fees on businesses and individuals that ultimately increase the cost of living for foreign residents. It's true that some of this can be traced back well before 2020 and the coronavirus and those kind of topics that have dominated our discussions for the last year or so. And really back to the period of 2014, 2015, the collapse of oil prices and the preceding period of austerity. So these trends have been in the making for some time, and it seems quite clear to me that the underlying policy challenges concerning expatriates aren't going away anytime soon. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our panel here with three initial questions I'm going to pose to each one of them. The first, I'm going to start with Omar. As we know, many governments, Gulf governments, are seeking to attract and retain expatriate professionals. But at the same time, we're seeing efforts to encourage citizens to work in positions traditionally held by expatriates. What are, in your view, the key economic considerations underlying these policies that enable expatriates to reside and work longer in Gulf countries? What's going on behind the scenes with policymakers when they're rolling out these initiatives?
Thanks very much, Robert, and to Ambassador Silliman and to AGSIW for hosting me today. I would highlight four factors. So previously, by previously, I'm talking about the period from, say, 1960 to 2000. The GCC countries had a lot of cash and liquidity, and that meant they could attract people from across the world to come and work in the Gulf based purely on salary alone. You'd have salaries that were several orders of magnitude higher than people would earn if they tried to perform the same job in their home country. Secondly, the economy could grow, was growing because of increasing hydrocarbon production and also because of increasing oil prices. And as a consequence, there was no need for the economy to innovate in order to grow in the long term. They're also investing in infrastructure, so they're getting growth from that. They didn't need foreign direct investment in any large quantity because, again, that's tied to the fact that they didn't really need to innovate. They could grow by using their own capital. And in addition to those factors, which we'll say are pull factors, they also had, and they were impeded in their ability to attract elite migrant workers because in the post-war era, the OECD countries, US, UK, France, Germany, etc., these were all generally in the business of attracting elite migrant workers from across the world, and they would assimilate them into their own citizenry. And so it's very difficult for a country like Bahrain or like Kuwait to compete with a country like Norway or the US when it comes to attracting an elite foreign citizen. Now, fast forward to, say, the post-oil price crash, with all the sort of political turbulence that's been going on in the Middle East in the last 15 or so years, you have all four factors have changed. First of all, there's a much more of a cash squeeze and much more of a liquidity squeeze in the Middle East. So some of the verging on absurd perks and financial and salaries that were available for sometimes very modest skills are no longer available or are certainly constrained. So that means that the Gulf countries can't just attract someone on salary alone, or certainly not as easily as they could before. Secondly, you mentioned the economic visions in your introduction. The economic visions reflect the fact that the Gulf countries are trying to innovate, and this is because the previous model of growth, which is infrastructure investment plus expanding hydrocarbon production and secular increases in oil prices, is no longer a viable source of growth, even if the populations were constant, and they're not. The populations are also growing. There's relatively high birth rates, and so that also increases the pressure on the balances. Thirdly, relatedly, there is a need for foreign direct investment. Several countries, most notably Bahrain and UAE, and now Saudi Arabia, are aggressively targeting, or have been targeting, foreign direct investment as a source of growth, both in terms of the direct jobs it creates and also as a way of importing technology. And finally, the West, as you've seen in the last 15 years, is starting to close its doors to people from all over the world. It's partly populist movements and changing, cultural demands and so on and so forth. And whereas, say, 20 years ago, at the turn of the millennium, it would have been unthinkable for an elite, the highest bracket of immigrant, to consider moving to somewhere like the UAE and residing there versus somewhere like US. It's now a serious consideration because sometimes the country in the West just doesn't want them, and sometimes it'll attract them, it'll accept them legally. But if I was a Muslim, I'd be anxious and apprehensive about moving to many places in the West because of sometimes quite blatant Islamophobia and racism and so on and so forth. Whereas in countries like the UAE, for example, there's a much more welcoming environment for a Muslim at the very least. And so these four changes mean that you now want to attract, there's a reform to the immigration system, and certainly at the elite bracket, you want to be able to attract these people. You realize that if you want to attract capital, you want to attract the Nobel Prize winners and superstar athletes and singers and so on and so forth, you have to give them more than what you used to give them. And there's also an opportunity to give them that.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really good job laying out some of the broad drivers taking place across the region. And what I want to do now is go over to Eman to look specifically, dig a little deeper into Saudi Arabia and pick up on some of these, on these themes. This is, of course, a country that you've written quite extensively about, and as we know, is a country that's in the midst of an ambitious economic and social transformation. I think we could have a whole nother discussion about at what stage is that transformation, what are the successes and failures. Maybe some of that will come up later in the discussion. But my question to you is, where do you see the economic interests of expatriates and citizens aligning? And where do you see some of the key areas of tension? Where Omar left off, I think was a good point to pick up here, because of course you can't attract the biggest and the best and have a thriving expatriate labor market and offer many of these individuals, skilled individuals, the perk that they need to come, while also fulfilling all of the demands of local job seekers. I think at some points and in some industries there's going to be a tension. Very curious to hear your thoughts on that point.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Robert, for this. Of course, as we all know, Saudi Arabia is going through a transition right now as it's working on implementing Vision 2030, which is a roadmap to a post-oil economy. The transformation, I think, is having a profound impact on the labor market. The Saudi leadership, of course, wants more citizens to take jobs in the private sector, which currently mostly hires expatriate workers. Of course, for many years, Saudis had been reluctant to take jobs in the private sector because of its low wages, long working hours, and of course, the general uncertainty of jobs in the private sector. Add to that, the rentier state system allowed the public sector to offer better wages, shorter working hours, but this has proven to be both unsustainable and draining. This is why the focus is now on creating more jobs for Saudis in the private sector. Now we see more and more Saudis actually willing to take jobs in the private sector. In the latest labor market statistics, a survey revealed that around 90% of Saudi men and women would accept a job in the private sector. And the majority of them also said that they wouldn't actually mind commuting for an hour or more. Of course, such indicators are adding more pressure on businesses that still tend to favor hiring expatriates over Saudis, despite the regulations that have been placed over the years to increase Saudiization. Now, and because of Vision 2030, we see more changes in the employment pattern, which can be attributed to a number of reasons. First of all, and for years now, Saudi Arabia has been trying to lower the number of low-skilled and undocumented workers. Of course, this is not unique of Saudi Arabia. We've seen similar trends in other Gulf countries. But on the other hand, more than 200 Saudis enter the workforce every year, but only half of that number is able to find work. Unemployment peaked to 15.4% last year due to the pandemic, but has dropped to 12.6 in the latest labor or the latest statistics, which is of course relatively high. Many of the unemployed Saudis have undergraduate and postgraduate degrees from abroad, yet they still struggle to find work. However, and as you mentioned in the introduction, and Omar also discussed, Saudi Arabia still wants to attract talents and skilled expatriates to implement Vision 2030. According to the Crown Prince's last interview in April, the numbers of expatriates are actually expected to increase because he said that they will help in the transition since they possess skills that Saudis do not have. So when you look at what kind of jobs are usually filled by Saudis and expatriates, you realize that there is some kind of hierarchy in the way these jobs are distributed. Low-wage jobs were traditionally given to migrant workers. Now more and more Saudis are accepting low-income jobs. Of course, jobs in certain sectors like construction will most likely still be filled by migrant workers. But still, today, Saudis are actually taking jobs that they would not have considered 10 years ago. And this is why the Crown Prince also said that 50% of jobs Saudis have today are, and I quote, bad jobs. However, when it comes to middle and senior positions in the private sector, many expatriates are usually given these jobs. This is why you hear more and more Saudis arguing that nationalization of jobs should also include leadership positions. But of course, this is going to be difficult during this transition due to the reasons I mentioned earlier. Lastly, I think it is interesting to see how the absolute centralization, which we have witnessed over the past few years, is not only relevant to the political structure, but has also affected the employment situation. Now, most of the jobs advertised are actually in the capital, Riyadh, which means people from other parts of the kingdom might need to move to the capital to find employment. Plans are currently underway to double the size of Riyadh from a population of around 7 million to 15 million by 2030. This is because, as the Crown Prince also said, that cities are important not only for the economy and development, but also for creating jobs. And he was referring to Riyadh in this example. We also saw earlier this year the announcement that international companies have to move their headquarters in the region to Saudi if they do not want to lose government contracts. Initially, the move was also considered important to create jobs for locals. At least this is what was initially, or the initial objective that was advertised in newspapers and on social media. But then the Minister of Investment, Khalid Al-Faleh, explained days later that companies will not be actually forced to hire nationals. So you see here how the plans to open up the country, attract foreign investors and talents are not always in synergy with efforts to solve unemployment, which is a pressing issue. I think this might be one of the most significant tensions that would require planning and efforts, but I do not think it will be resolved anytime soon. So I will stop here, but we can always discuss this further in the Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that. I'm going to pick up on one of the points you mentioned at least a couple of times in your remarks about the expectation that the growth trajectories for many of these countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, will require a growing population, many of which, that population will include many, not just local citizens, but also many expatriates. That also goes for the United Arab Emirates. I mean, even more so, I would say, if we're looking at the demographic group that will constitute that growing population. If you look at economic plans and strategies in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or nationally, we see, tremendous targets for growing populations in these Emirates. And the majority of that population is not going to be local Emirati citizens. They will, in fact, if those targets are met, have to be expatriates. So I'm going to go over to Noora. This is a country that she knows very, very well and has looked at specifically efforts to codify the conditional inclusion, I think was the words that you used in some point in your book, of certain populations in the UAE. And I'm very curious to get your thoughts here about how some of the recent legal changes in the UAE permitting expatriates to receive Emirati citizenship, as well as a number of other long-term residency schemes that we have certainly have been gaining some speed over the past few months and year or so, such as the Golden Visa. How does this fit in with the notion of conditional inclusion that you discuss in your book?
Great. Thank you for that question, and thank you for having me. Short answer, it just kind of reinforces forms of conditional inclusion, these new trends that we've seen. But just for the audience, to let me try to explain briefly what I mean by conditional inclusion, which has both a kind of legal dimension and a behavioral dimension when it comes to understanding citizenship. So from the legal side, a conditional inclusion simply means authorized residency that falls short of full inclusive citizenship rights. And in that sense, I think it's really important to remark from the very beginning that the Gulf is not exceptional in developing these kinds of legal statuses that authorize residency and certain aspects of residency, like work authorization, that do not fall into full inclusion. 60% of US visas are non-immigrant visas. Your time in these visas doesn't count towards permanent residency or citizenship. And I think in other states, we see different variations. And so there are immigrant visa routes. There are different paths towards permanent residency and citizenship, and then some people don't. And typically with these temporary statuses, we see them being developed for the purposes of labor authorization or humanitarian protection. So they're supposed to be temporary, but in a lot of different places, we see these kinds of temporary visas become more permanent with renewals. And in the Gulf, I think what we're seeing is these new openings of paths of permanent residency and citizenship. So we're starting to look more like the rest of the world, but I think it's important not to think of us as a kind of deviation from global trends, but maybe where we're seeing it in its most extreme forms of these kinds of temporary statuses. So that's the legal dimension, rights to reside in a country that falls short of citizenship rights. But what does that do kind of behaviorally is it makes citizenship it creates a kind of competitive dynamic around citizenship. And so one of the things that I found that was interesting talking to, I'll say one thing that's unique about the UAE is that because it's a federation, from the 1950s onwards, individual emirates were issuing their own passports. And so once you have the formation of the union, you develop a kind of differentiated citizenship where some people have passports, but they're more travel documents, because the key nationality document is the Khalasat al-Qaid, or the family book. And so that's the document that gives you access to the robust benefits that you get as a citizen. So you have already this kind of differentiation where some people have passports, but without the family books. And from my understanding, and I don't have, this is more anecdotal data, these new talented citizenship people who are getting these new Emirati forms of citizenship are more travel documents. It's a very powerful travel document, the UAE. It's one of, it's unlocked visa-free access to most of the globe, including Schengen. It's quite unique in that sense for the region, for the Middle East. But from my understanding, that doesn't also include the nationality document of the Khalasat al-Qaid. So already you see this kind of conditional inclusion where you have some rights, but not full citizenship rights. And I think one of the things that's interesting for me when I was talking to people who have, passports, but not the Khalasat al-Qaid, is the way that they didn't say, no, everyone should get citizenship in the UAE, or that this isn't a question of national security. They said, no, it should be controlled. We should make sure that people aren't just claiming allegiance to the state for instrumental material gains, but I'm allegiant. And so it kind of creates this performative or behavioral dimension of wanting to prove that you are worthy of inclusion. And so I think that these new forms also make citizenship contingent on certain kind of behavior, being exceptionally talented, being exceptionally wealthy, as being, these are the kinds of, instead of citizenship being based on more objective eligibility criteria, such as duration of residency in the state or language acquisition or cultural assimilation, even though those are kind of sometimes hard to measure as well, it becomes this kind of competitive dynamic of what are you, your access to rights is contingent upon a certain kind of performance of being exceptional.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this notion of competitive dynamics around citizenship and throw a follow-up question back to you, Noora, and then bring in Omar and Eman to weigh in as well. What we can glean, or at least what I can glean from the UAE's announcement about these legal changes to allow expatriates to receive Emirati citizenship, is that the process appears to be a pretty subjective one. I think there are other questions too about how many people this was actually applied to, but it seems quite clear that it's going to be relatively subjective based on nomination from either members of the government or other elites, political elites, members of the royal family, different royal families. My question is, based on your research into citizenship, should this process and potentially others that may emerge across the region in other countries and other governments, should it be more objective, and how would governments actually go about doing this, making it a more objective, I hesitate to say merit-based, because then it gets us back to this kind of competitive dynamic, but somewhat more objective. Happy to hear also Omar and Eman weigh in either on this or the other question being, what exactly are the scope of benefits that should be afforded to either newly naturalized citizens in the region or those who acquire a long-term residency that make them in effect permanent residents and members of these societies? And where do you draw the line, and what what's going to be easier to grant, what will be a little bit harder to do and take some time? So let me start with you, Noora, if you don't mind, and then we'll go to both to Omar and Eman as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at, Elizabeth Cohen has this beautiful book called The Political Value of Time. And what you see in a lot of citizenship regimes, the way of trying to develop objective criteria for who gets rights is time spent in the country. That's why tourists have less rights than permanent residents, and permanent residents have less rights than citizens. The idea is that over time, which is experienced in a uniform, equitable way by human beings, right? That becomes a more kind of, at least in democratic liberal theory, that this is very valuable, that we kind of connect political value to time spent in a country. So that's one way of thinking about it. And I think that if you talk to people who've been in the UAE over generations, they feel that there is that should be a way of accruing rights, is that you've spent time in this country, you've shown your allegiance in that way. Again, this kind of competitive dynamics is global, right? We know that almost a fifth of the globe now has these citizenship by investment schemes or citizenship by residency by investment schemes. And so what we see is what those kinds of schemes do is speed up time, that you can kind of purchase your way into citizenship and exchange money for time. So, that doesn't fully answer your question, but thinking about what are other metrics, a key metric might be how duration of residency within a state, and we kind of start to create value around different increments of time to suggest that, meeting certain thresholds of time should be allocated towards meeting different thresholds in terms of having certain rights.
Great, thank you. Omar, Eman, would you like to weigh in here?
Thanks, Robert. So just on the issue of innovation. So from the economics perspective, the crux of the issue is innovation, because these Gulf countries, despite spending huge amounts of money on all sorts of types of economic activity and investments, their innovation still is significantly below what they need in order to maintain the living standards they have now. And even if you take, I think the only example anyone can think of a homegrown, quasi-homegrown, I would say, entrepreneurial success story is Careem, and Careem is just a clone of Uber. And you can't name most people can't name another single startup. Now there are a few others here and there, but nothing that really has world status. Now, if you look at, and there's two problems with the prevailing immigration system that lead to that. The first is that, people, these elite migrants, they don't want to train and invest in the new generation of Emiratis, Bahrainis, Kuwaitis, whatever, if they're just going to be there for 4 or 6 years. And they may be kicked out, now. So, and it's going back to the synergies issue that Eman mentioned. You've got a tension where, you've got several countries at the same time as they want to attract foreigners are getting very aggressive with their nationalization policies and enacting, what sometimes look like very arbitrary, get all these foreigners out of here policies. And if I was an elite, a highly educated Frenchman or a German, I'd be very reticent about, setting up shop in one of these countries if at some point they could be like, actually now 100% nationalization, goodbye. So you've got one problem, which is they don't want to set up shop in the way that promotes innovation. And the other thing is that now in the US, with all this anti-immigrant sentiment, there's a big literature in economics now exposing exactly how innovative immigrants have been in the last 80, 90 years, or even more in the US. So if you look at, the economists are getting really into the weeds of the data and showing how bringing immigrants in is good for innovation. And then there's also, you get the high-end names like, what's his name, Elon Musk and so on. But even, further down, you get it. And more importantly, it's not as if you can just cherry pick them. Very often, people like, the guy who made Google, Sergey, I forget his name, the Russian, these people, their parents are, average quality, so to speak, immigrants, but then their kids turn out to be, these stars. So you've got you've got a clear and link between innovation / economic prosperity and immigration. And they're beginning to understand that. And in the end, so I think, so Noora's indicating that there's still a reticence about opening doors fully, but in the end, I think they're just going to have to bite the bullet, because every time they dance around the issue with these sort of half citizenship efforts, it doesn't cut the mustard when it comes to getting innovation. It may cut the mustard in terms of investment, because I don't mind investing in the UAE, but I don't bring new ideas and entrepreneurial innovation and so on unless I'm actually part of the social fabric there. And to be part of the social fabric, I have to feel secure in my citizenship, and I have to want to set up shop there for a very long time.
Eman, if more governments do, as Omar said, bite the bullet and offer citizenship, or these, essentially citizenship, long-term residency, I mean, what do you think are the benefits and the perks of citizenship that will go along with that? What are the ones that are going to be easier for governments to offer and will be attractive to these expatriates? And what are the ones that will be a bit more difficult, a more difficult pill to swallow?
I think, when it comes to citizenship, and if we look at the Saudi case, I think it's going to be difficult because, citizenship in Saudi is very selective, and it's been the case for forever. So I think now much focus is on the residency, or the premium, as they call it, the premium residency permit. This is where, you see much of the discussion unfolding. And since, Noora and Omar mentioned some very interesting points, but I think one of the things that I've noticed recently recently, not only in the case of Saudi, but also in the case of the UAE, is that these changes are making people speak more about, what about the children of Emirati women married to foreigners, or what is the case of Saudi women married to foreigners? Their children, they have to renew their visa quite, they obviously they don't have a permanent visa, and obviously not the citizenship. So there is no more debate in Saudi, at least we see that, of, why if we offer the permanent residence to, businessmen and entrepreneurs, why don't we also do that for our children? And I've seen these Shura Council members, some of them are trying to push some kind of a proposal to introduce that. So I think here where you find, the economic interests intersect with social issues and aspirations that have long been discussed but quite marginalized. So I think this is where you find some real interesting tensions, maybe in the now and of course in the future.
I'm gonna bring in one of the questions that specifically mentioned the UAE's naturalization scheme or citizenship scheme, and the question had to do with allowing newly naturalized citizens to retain their existing citizenships and some of the tensions that might create. I wonder if Noora could walk us through some of the considerations between when citizenship is extended, based on your research. I mean, the different, of course, I imagine there are a number of different models, but what are the considerations that policymakers must bring on board to decide whether, an individual can retain their existing citizenship and while they receive a new one, and how do you expect that to play out in the UAE?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I really been enjoying the conversation so far. I have a couple of different threads I want to pick up on. I saw that thank you, Eman, for mentioning the women from the region, and there's also a question in the chat about statelessness. So we know that the kind of gendered notions of citizenship acquisition, the fact that these are patrilineal citizenship regimes, becomes a key source of statelessness in our region as well. In addition to, even if your husband has a secure citizenship status, then your children constantly have to kind of renew their visas. And so thank you very much for bringing that. I will say that the UAE did change the citizenship law and allows, on paper at least, women to grant citizenship to their children. From my understanding, that's mostly since that law has been passed, I think in 2012, and hasn't been retroactively applied to people whose moms were not able to do so at a previous period. So also it's not clear whether that's just a law on paper and whether it's actually being implemented. So there is some move towards moving away from just patrilineal. But on this question, Robert, that you pose about, and thank you, I think it's Mira in the chat who poses this question about dual nationality. This is a big topic in the formation of citizenship regimes more broadly, because the idea is that, we have this imagined nation state system. Your allegiance has to be to one state. So if you have dual nationality, then this could create split allegiance, particularly if these two different countries are kind of warring, where are your allegiance going to lie, et cetera. So this has been a big debate even outside of the Gulf. My understanding, again, my just assessment of the logic for doing so for these new citizenship acquisitions is precisely because the Khalasat al-Qaid, the nationality document, is not being allocated alongside these new passports. So they're more sort of travel documents that, and in terms of their domestic rights, they allow you to reside without needing a kafil, a national sponsor, without having to constantly renew and pay these fees for residency rights. But they fall short of full citizenship. And I think that's precisely why we see this possibility of dual nationality, because what's being given is a document more than nationality in the way that we understand it. It still, I think, remains a kind of ethno-national understanding of who can really be a citizen. And hence this differentiation kind of continues. Can I just say one thing on in response to what Omar was talking about, and thank you, Eman, for kind of connecting the social and economic aspects. I will say that, for me, the quintessential example of why we are vulnerable by not having more permanent forms of residency or citizenship is thinking of 2008, in other parts of the world, the image of the economic crisis was unemployment lines. In Dubai, it was abandoned cars. So, in moments of economic crises, you don't have a way of kind of keeping people in, and they can defect on loan. So it does make us economically vulnerable, and I think socially vulnerable when you have very large proportions of the population who don't have secure rights to reside in the country if they don't have a job, if they have to leave the minute they lose that job.
And that's a great point to maybe zoom back out for a minute and circle back to one of the first questions we received from Matteo Lagrenzi. I mean, this is, I think, an important point. He says, how fleeting has labor market regulation been in the past 10 years in the GCC country? I mean, how permanent should we expect many of these changes in either direction to be in the next 10 years? And I think that's, as we were really in the weeds here, and now to look back and say, yes, a lot has happened. And labor market regulations have been going on for a long time. I looked actually as a master's student, I studied Emiratization in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and looked at how the number of different government entities were created and changed and shifted, and the regulations move back and forth. I mean, you can certainly discern trends, but there are a lot of changes. We look across the region, as Omar mentioned, as Eman said, I mean, they are sometimes changing overnight. So I guess the question is, to throw it back to the panelists here, maybe we'll start with Eman. How durable, how persistent do you see these changes? Is there a coherence, or are we seeing reactions to various economic crises that there's, hurry up and go around these periods of acute crises, and then things kind of relax, slow down, budgets are in better shape, then, then there's this period of easing, and we see a little bit laxer approach. What's your take on it?
I think if we look at the Saudi case, there is, so much change happening, and I don't think we will see any slowdown. And sometimes, as Omar said, also some of these new laws or new reforms are kind of, not really, they can be in conflict with one another. So, for example, I'll give you the, last year they introduced, or actually, I think actually this year, they introduced the labor reforms in Saudi, which is called the Improving the Contractual Relationship Initiative, مبادرة تحسين العلاقة التعاقدية. So they mentioned last year that they will have it in effect, or they will implement it in March. And lots of businesses were complaining that please try maybe to postpone it a little bit. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And they didn't. So until the last minute, people were thinking it's going to be postponed because it doesn't work now to, implement it. So I think in the Saudi case, there is so much pressure to, catch up with Dubai in terms of, attracting talents, tourism, and so on. And on the other hand, really shake the private sector. We've seen the Crown Prince recently introduce Sharik and other initiatives to really make the private sector contribute, as opposed to, being reliant on the government for a long time. So I think the Saudi case is quite interesting, and, to keep an eye on it. It's, quite, there's always something happening almost every day. So it's, I think when it comes to the employment situation, this is also going to be very much, I would say not really. I wouldn't call that there is more of a long-term approach, but maybe short-term, or short-term objectives that they're trying to set now, and especially in terms of attracting talents and so on. And this is why the employment situation is not really, for example, solved in that regard.
Great. Over to Omar. I mean, what's your take on the durability of labor market regulations? Obviously, that's a big topic. But if we just look at workforce nationalization across the region, I would agree with Eman in many respects. This is definitely not going to slow down. But I guess the question is, there's not always the sense of coherence in these policies. You see in a country like Saudi Arabia dealing with a number of different government entities and very different demographic concerns. That creates this kind of lack of coherence, maybe part and parcel of the reason why the government has announced this policy office to create more coherence and better streamlined policies. We'll see if that how that pans out for them. But then in other countries like the UAE, different emirates with various degrees of economic autonomy and all of their different government bodies taking charge of workforce nationalization. What's your take on this? And maybe, I mean, you also, if we could bring in Bahrain, it would be interesting as well into the discussion.
So, I mean, as a citizen of the Gulf and as a resident of the Gulf, and also as someone who's married to a Saudi woman, so as someone who experiences some of these issues directly, as a Bahraini citizen married to a Saudi woman, I would say, first of all, that, in terms of the durability, if we're going to be honest, policy making in the GCC tends to be, somewhat capricious, and it can be very difficult to get to pin, a specific strategic vision and adhere to it over time. However, if I'm going to try to be a bit more optimistic, I would say that there is a really big opportunity before the GCC states here if they do demonstrate commitment in their immigration reforms. If you remember during, I think it was Obama's first term, do you remember the boy? I think he may have been in Texas. His name was Ahmed, and he made a computer project. We took it to school, and they said he's going to make a bomb. His teacher accused him of making a bomb, and so then there was a big national scandal in America about how he was being treated as being racist to him because of his name and appearance and so on and so forth. And in the end, I think his family and him moved to Qatar. They were offered some sort of opportunity to go to Qatar. And I think they relocated. I don't know if they're still there or if they moved back. The reason I mention this is because, there's a big open goal in front of the Gulf countries in terms of attracting elite Muslims all over the world. There are, the population of Muslims is about 1.5 billion. And, we've gone to a situation where there was sort of latent dislike of Muslims to sort of naked hostility to Muslims. And a place like Saudi Arabia, all the Gulf countries, first of all, are attractive, not just because they're Muslim countries, but also because you have the Haram and the Haram Mecca, and both the two most holy sites, Mecca and Medina. And you ask any Muslim, they would love to be able to perform Umrah once a month. This is the lesser pilgrimage, once a month, once a week, however often they could do it. It's something which is actually very important to many Muslims on the world. So, not only is it a situation where Muslims don't feel welcome in many countries, and those countries are closing their doors, the GCC, anyone who's a GCC citizen has preferential access to Mecca and Medina, whether it's for the lesser pilgrimage, the greater pilgrimage. And this is something which is potentially really valuable. So if they want to take advantage of this opportunity, then they need to make these policies durable. You mentioned, Noora mentioned the reason for this, allowing dual citizenship. I agree with her that that's probably 90% of the reason. But if I gave a good 10% of the reason, if I spin it to something slightly more positive, I would say that, and this is specifically because the description of the policy came from Mohammed bin Rashid, who, is someone who's economically at least very progressive. When by allowing dual citizenship, it's actually a commitment device from the government that if you're unsure about how permanent this is, you can always keep your other citizenship, and that's a way of you being confident in you won't be left with nothing as a result of some capricious future policy decision. And there's many migrant communities in the world for whom dual citizenship has been integral to them helping the economy, their home economy, and the economy they're living in, and the one they came from. If you look at, for example, Turkish immigrants in Germany, or if you look at Israelis in the US, many South Americans in the US, Mexicans, and so on and so forth. So Chinese and Koreans. So there are opportunities. So dual citizenship is something which it's a double-edged sword. In some sense, it gives the government a backdoor for stripping you of your rights, but in some sense, it's also a way of giving you confidence that we're on the right path, and it's going to take us a while to get there. And until we get there, you can rest assured that if things don't go the way you want, you can always move back to your home country, and you haven't lost anything.
We had two questions specifically on Saudi Arabia, picking up on the thread of the headquartering policy, but also talking about NEOM and some of the efforts to market NEOM to international business people and also regional and international residents as well to come to live, work and I guess be entertained in NEOM. The question here, if I try to put these two together, maybe I'll turn it over first to Eman, is how successful of a value proposition do you think that these two initiatives, the headquartering policy, and also NEOM as a project, are in terms of attracting some of these foreign residents? I mean, do you think that is on the path to success? And if so, how long will it take? I suspect it's going to take some time. And second is, what's the impact that you expect for Saudi Arabia's regional neighbors, specifically the UAE, but also Bahrain? And we might be able to bring in some of the other guests as well to speak about that. So let me turn it over to you, Eman.
Yeah, so this year Saudi announced that they are introducing new judicial laws to make, of course, the country more attractive for families, and I think also more transparent for businesses. So they're definitely trying to, trying to make it more, appealing. But of course, you're competing with Dubai, so of course this is going to be still a problem. And when it comes to the headquarters, of course, I think in the beginning, many Saudis were happy with the decision because, of course, many of the headquarters are in Dubai. But of course, goes back to the idea of competition. And I think, it's no secret. There is so much competition in the Gulf right now. When you look at the visions, they're very much similar. Saudi, for example, is putting so much effort on tourism. It thinks that, tourism in Saudi Arabia is definitely different from other Gulf countries. But, if, for example, someone wants to go on vacation in the Gulf, there is more or less very similar scenes or, landscapes or sites to visit. So I would say that competition is definitely something that we are seeing now, and it's going to, continue. The move of the headquarters, I think some companies have already done that already. So the only issue, and I think I mentioned that, is it going to generate jobs for the locals? And of course, in the beginning, that was considered very important and the objective of the whole move. And a few days later, it was, of course, you cannot force companies to hire nationals. So there is a limit to how much you can, nationalize jobs when you are also trying to attract investors and so on. So, and this goes back to the idea of, you're trying to do different things at the same time, and this is where we see these tensions. I'll leave it up to here. Maybe Omar wants to add something.
It's okay. I'll wait for the next question. Or next, we give the audience a chance to pose any more questions.
Great. All right. I have another question then. Let's shifting over to the UAE, picking up on the notion of competition. There's been a lot of talk, and this is kind of a continuing debate about what's going on in Saudi Arabia will have various effects on the UAE's economy, on its ability to attract and retain expatriates. I think, at least from my perspective, it's not going to happen immediately, but there's certainly a good case to be made for that, given the ambitious targets and the ambitious projects underway in Saudi Arabia. But if we look at the UAE, one of the questions for you, Noora, is, do we have a sense of how expatriates are receiving these kind of long-term visas or and also citizenship? I know that's a new initiative, so we might not have the figures on the citizenship scheme. But when we look at other long-term visas, what types of visas are the different demographic segments of expatriates in the UAE receiving? And is there a way for us to quantify this number and get a better understanding of how successful and widespread these various schemes and initiatives are?
Yeah, great. I mean, I wish I could quantify it for you, and I don't have a firm number. I mean, the clearest number would come from the Ministry of Interior. I think that with these investment, at least the visas, investor visas, you would probably also be able to capture some of that from the private sector, because you have all these immigration firms and citizenship by investment firms that do this kind of brokering and help facilitate the purchasing of these kinds of visas. The key to these investor visas is you're eliminating the role of the kafil. And I think probably our audience seems very in tuned with the Gulf politics, so they know what this is, but just in case, the idea of every non-citizen has to have a national sponsor who is either a citizen or a citizen majority owned company, who is responsible for recruitment, residency, and repatriation. So deportation here is decentralized. The whole migration enforcement system is kind of decentralized. And so these investor visas are a way to kind of eliminate some of those key restrictions on labor mobility and also disentangle residency from work. And so you can continue to reside in the country, even if you're sort of changing jobs, et cetera. There are, I mean, on this, like on big picture durability, big picture economic change, what we've seen is a transition, from Indian Ocean trade to oil. And then there are a number of, I really appreciate these questions on statelessness and on denaturalization for political reasons. And I think one of the things we haven't mentioned is that we have ethnic minorities in the Gulf, right? That up until the 1950s and 1960s, we rarely talk about it, but we had slavery. And so our societies are much more less homogenous than we kind of present them to be as being purely Arab, right? That we have Persians, we have South Asians, East Africans who are part of our communities. And I think that as we've seen this kind of transition to oil, there was a real kind of emphasis on how do you prevent, how do you make sure that people aren't just coming to this region in order to have these kinds of instrumental gains because of the materiality of this region. And so we see the codification of these citizenship regimes in very stringent ways, also because of thinking of that political economy. So now as we're transitioning, I think we also have to think about what does that mean in terms of rights and who to count and who to integrate. And we're also, a lot of the emphasis is towards more service industry, but because we've had such a dependence on guest workers, quote unquote, I think Gulf citizens are sometimes, not willing to do those service industry jobs. And so we have a kind of contradiction between what the needs of the economy are and the expectations of what it means to be a citizen and what jobs are appropriate for you as a citizen.
Yeah, in terms of the big picture, Omar, in his article with Cairo Review, he did mention the need for a new model in the Gulf's labor market. This is the article where he talks about corporate janissaries. I wonder, as we start wrapping things up here and try to think about the bigger picture and where we go from here, maybe I'll let Omar start by saying, in your mind, what does this new model look like? Where's the next step? When you were specifically talking about highly skilled expatriates working within family businesses, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, these are the types of people who are probably not going anywhere right away. At least they're on the higher end of the priority in terms of the types of expatriates that many of these governments want to retain or continue to attract. So, and what does this new model look like? And I'll start with you, and then let both Eman and Noora have some final words as well.
It's important to distinguish the policy discussions and the economic dynamics differ significantly between unskilled or low-skilled workers and the sort of high-skilled ones. And as far as today's discussion is concerned, we've been focused on the residency and citizenship zone. This is something which is exclusively, I think that's not an exaggeration, reserved for the highly skilled immigrants. In terms of the new model, I think that in the long run, with the exception, as Eman mentioned, with these nationalization policies, with the exception of certain sectors like construction and refuse collection, or a few very specific job types, in general, we're going to be seeing a consistent denudation of the role of low-skilled migrant workers in the economy. This is partially in response to the perception, and I think it's not an accurate perception, because economic illiteracy is quite rife in the Gulf, as it is everywhere at the moment. But this incorrect but present assumption that if you kick out these low-skilled workers, that suddenly is going to mean that nationals are going to be, having $50,000 a month salaries and wonderful jobs and so on and so forth. But that perception is there, and so that's going to be propelling them to slowly continue to make it harder and harder and harder for low-skilled migrants. However, In terms of the new model for elites, it is going to continue, I think, very much on the grounds we're seeing. And although I agree with Noora and Eman that there are sort of question marks over the completeness of the citizenship and so on, I think if you take it in a macro historical sense, these things have how much reforms have happened in such a short period of time that this is actually quite fast. So if you give it another 10 years, I think there'll be a lot more credibility. And it's because of the economic reality that you have to make these reforms. If you want to get the innovation, you have to do this. And as an indicator, and I think this is going to mixing politics with economics. But if you see how aggressive the UAE has been in its investments with Israel in the last 6 months, it's not even been that. I think this is my assumption. This is not something I've read a policy document about, but I think an important driver of that is that Israel is by any metric a highly innovative country. It has a lot of top quality entrepreneurs, and so UAE wants to as quickly as possible leverage its new political relationship with Israel in order to bring a lot of those entrepreneurs over to UAE. Israel is having economic difficulties. Israelis would probably rather live in the UAE, a few hundred miles away from Israel than they would in, Japan or California, which is just much more hassle to get to, especially in the COVID era. UAE has built up a lot of credibility now in the COVID era in terms of keeping its doors open and not enforcing, strict everybody get out or nobody can get in or out policies. And so I think that the new model will be a continuation of everything we've discussed today and an institutionalization of it at the elite level and at the low skilled level, a continuing marginalization, and then eventually maybe 20, 30 years from now, with the exception of certain jobs like domestic helpers or refuse collectors, it will be almost completely all nationals doing them.
Noora, Eman, final words on next steps forwards, in any country you'd like to discuss, or the region broadly?
I mean, I think, we've been talking a lot about some of the negatives. Let me mention something about the Gulf that I appreciate, which is we have really high proportions of immigrants, but we don't see the same levels of anti-immigrant rhetoric and populism and mobilization against that. That might be because we don't grant citizenship, right? So that it doesn't seem like it's an existential threat to people to have really large numbers of immigrants. But I like to use it as an example when thinking about other parts of the globe, and you see anti-immigrant sentiment that's not automatic, that there are other ways of organizing societies. With that in mind, I think that the real reform has to come from capturing the long-term residents who have been who are not these investors or exceptionally talented people that are kind of new to the region, but really have put in the time. For me, that I think is the route towards more stability and inclusion.
Eman, anything to add, or is that a nice?
Omar and Noora did a great job, so I actually have nothing to add.
Great. Well, we have exceeded our time limit a little bit. There's so much more to cover, so many more insights to dig out of the panelists, and I tried my best to get to as many questions as possible. Sincere apologies if I didn't get to your question, but we'll have more programs where hopefully we can get to them in the future. Thank you all so much. Please always encourage people to continue to check out our website, look for upcoming events, look for our latest work. Many of the faces here have contributed great pieces, and we're going to try to get Noora as well at some point to put her pen onto our website as well. So thank you very much again, and have a great rest of the summer.